We like to believe that the animals we love, feed, and raise will love us back. A pet feels like family. A rescued predator feels like a friend. Years of feeding, walking, and caring for an animal can feel like proof of an unbreakable bond, the kind that surely changes what an animal is capable of. But underneath fur, feathers, and scales, instinct never fully disappears. It doesn't get trained away, and it doesn't get loved away. It simply waits, quiet and patient, sometimes for years, until the exact wrong moment arrives. A door left unlocked, a window rolled down, a barrier crossed just a little too far. And when that instinct wakes up, the results can be devastating, sudden, and permanent. These are true stories of people who trusted an animal completely, in some cases for a single afternoon, and in others for the better part of a decade, and paid the ultimate price for it. In February 2009, in Stamford, Connecticut, a woman named Charla Nash drove to the home of her friend Sandra Harold for what should have been an ordinary afternoon visit. Inside that house lived Travis, a 200-pound chimpanzee who had been raised almost entirely as a human child. He slept in a bed, ate at the table, drank from a glass, used a house key, and had even appeared in television commercials. To everyone who knew him, Travis felt less like an animal and more like a member of the family. But a chimpanzee's body doesn't work like ours. Adult chimps carry several times the raw strength of a grown man, built from dense, fast-twitch muscle fibers meant for climbing trees and fighting for dominance in the wild. That afternoon, something set Travis off. Accounts point to his agitation over a toy Charlo was holding. Sandra tried to calm him down using an anti-anxiety medication mixed into his tea, but instead of settling him, it may have only added to his confusion. Then, without warning, he attacked. What followed was one of the most horrific maulings ever recorded in the United States. Sandra stabbed Travis repeatedly with a kitchen knife, trying to pull him off her friend, screaming at him to stop. He barely reacted. When police arrived, officers found the animal still in a rage and were forced to shoot him before he could cause more harm. Charla survived, but she lost her eyes, her nose, her lips, and both of her hands. The case forced an entire country to confront an uncomfortable truth. No amount of love can override millions of years of instinct. Zoos build their fences and moats for a reason, and on an April afternoon in 2009 at the Berlin Zoo, that reason became terrifyingly clear. A 34-year-old woman climbed over the enclosure barriers surrounding the polar bear habitat, not by accident, but deliberately, moving past one safety barrier after another until she was in the water with the bears themselves. She couldn't have picked a worse moment. It was near feeding time, when polar bears are at their most alert and their most territorial. Within moments, one of the bears turned on her, biting into her back and hands and dragging her through the pool while stunned visitors screamed from above. Zoo staff scrambled to respond, throwing life rings and using poles to try to force the animal back while colleagues raced for help. She was eventually pulled from the enclosure alive, but with severe injuries from the attack. She survived, but only barely, a stark reminder that the glass and fencing at a zoo aren't decorations. They're the only thing standing between admiration and disaster. Not every tragedy comes from a stranger's bad judgment. Sometimes it comes after years of genuine trust. At a private wildlife reserve in South Africa, a lion named Jupiter, hand-raised from a cub by a well-known animal behaviorist who had spent years walking beside him, feeding him, and building what looked like an unbreakable relationship, turned on a young woman during a walk with the reserve's lions. Wildlife experts who studied the case afterward pointed to the same unsettling conclusion they reach again and again. A predator raised in captivity can appear tame for years, can seem to recognize and even show affection toward the humans who care for it, and still revert to raw predatory behavior in an instant, without warning, and without any single provocation anyone can point to. The incident reignited a fierce debate across the wildlife tourism industry about whether lion walks and hands-on encounters with apex predators should exist at all, no matter how experienced the handler. Not every fatal encounter takes years of built-up familiarity. Sometimes all it takes is one broken rule. At a private game reserve outside Johannesburg in the summer of 2015, an American tourist was riding through a lion enclosure in a car, the kind of self-drive safari where visitors are explicitly warned, again and again, on signs and slips of paper handed out at the gate. Keep your windows up at all times. For reasons that will never be fully known, the windows in her vehicle were down as she photographed the lions moving alongside the car. A lioness approached from the passenger side. In an instant, she lunged through the open window and bit down. The driver fought back, striking the animal and suffering serious injuries to his arm before park staff could chase the lion away. Paramedics arrived quickly, but it was too late. She did not survive. Park officials later admitted the safety measures in place were more than adequate, if only they had been followed. It's a devastating lesson repeated across nearly every big cat encounter on record. A few inches of glass is often the only thing separating a photograph from a funeral. Some of these stories aren't really about an animal's instinct at all. They're about what happens when a person decides the rules of containment simply don't apply to them. In October 2011, in Zanesville, Ohio, a private exotic animal owner named Terry Thompson kept dozens of dangerous predators on his own rural property: Bengal tigers, African lions, grizzly bears, wolves, and leopards, largely unregulated and largely unknown to most of his neighbors beyond the roars they sometimes heard at night. That evening, Thompson opened cage after cage, releasing nearly 50 exotic animals across the surrounding countryside before taking his own life. When sheriff's deputies arrived, they walked into what one officer would later describe as something closer to a nightmare than a crime scene: 400-pound tigers wandering through open fields near family homes, lions pacing along roadways in the dark. With night falling and no way to safely dart or contain animals capable of killing a person in seconds, deputies made the agonizing decision to shoot the escaped predators rather than risk them reaching nearby houses. By the next morning, nearly 50 animals were dead, including a large number of rare Bengal tigers. It remains one of the starkest examples in American history of how quickly private ownership of apex predators can spiral into catastrophe, not because the animals did anything wrong, but because one person decided that fences were optional. Not every dangerous animal attacks out of aggression. Some simply do what their bodies are built to do, with no malice involved at all. In October 2019, police in Oxford, Indiana, entered the home of 36-year-old Laura Hurst after she failed to show up for work. She was a passionate, experienced reptile keeper who shared her house with roughly 140 snakes. Officers found her body with an 8-foot reticulated python still wrapped around her, so tightly coiled that responders struggled to remove it. Reticulated pythons aren't aggressive the way a big cat is aggressive. Their behavior is mechanical, almost automatic. Once a coil tightens around prey, every exhale of breath is met with the snake squeezing further, over and over, until the victim's circulation and breathing stop entirely. Researchers studying large constrictors have found that this kind of pressure can trigger cardiac arrest within seconds, often before suffocation even has the chance to finish the job. Laura had handled snakes for years and was known in the reptile community as careful and capable. But investigators believe that whatever happened that night, she was alone in a room with an animal that doesn't understand affection, doesn't recognize a familiar face, and doesn't stop once its instinct takes over. There were no screams reported by neighbors, just silence, and a python that was only ever doing what its body was designed to do. Sometimes the most heartbreaking stories involve animals that showed no prior warning signs at all. In August 2011, in Pacifica, California, 32-year-old Darlene Apora was home alone with her family's pit bull. She was 6 months pregnant and known among friends as an outspoken defender of the breed, someone who regularly pushed back online against the idea that pit bulls were inherently dangerous. That afternoon, without any indication of provocation, abuse, or forced entry, the dog attacked her. Neighbors heard screaming, and when emergency responders arrived, they found Darla suffering from catastrophic injuries to her neck and upper body. She died at the scene, along with her unborn child. Investigators found no explanation, no history of aggression, no trigger anyone could identify after the fact. Animal behavior researchers who study fatal dog attacks point to something called rapid escalation, a powerful dog moving from calm to full predatory drive within seconds, often targeting the face, throat, and limbs because those are the areas that trigger instinctive restraint responses bred into working and hunting dogs generations ago. Darla's death became a national flashpoint in the debate over breed-specific danger, precisely because she had spent so much of her life arguing the opposite case. Not every story on this list involves an exotic pet or a safari gone wrong. Sometimes the danger simply walks up to your front door. In November 2023, in the small Sierra Nevada town of Downeyville, California, 71-year-old Patrice Miller was found dead inside her own home after neighbors reported she hadn't been seen in days. Sheriff's deputies arrived for a welfare check and found a broken door, bear scat scattered across the porch, and unmistakable signs that a bear had forced its way inside. At first, investigators believed Miller had died of natural causes before the bear ever entered the house. But months later, an autopsy told a different story. She had died from a bear mauling, with a bite or swipe wound to her neck. DNA testing matched the attack to a bear that had already been trapped and euthanized after repeatedly returning to the property. It turned out Miller had been dealing with the same bear for months. She'd once struck it to keep it away from her home, and weeks before her death had woken to find its paw reaching through a cracked window. Wildlife officials confirmed it as the first documented fatal black bear attack on a human in California's recorded history, a grim milestone in a state that is home to well over 30,000 black bears. Experts were careful to point out that black bears are not naturally aggressive toward people, but once an animal learns to associate a house with food, its fear of humans can disappear entirely, and with it, any predictable boundary between curiosity and danger. None of these animals were monsters. A polar bear at feeding time, a lion that spent years being hand-raised, a python doing exactly what its body was built to do, a family dog with no history of violence at all. In almost every case, the animal was simply behaving like an animal. The tragedy wasn't cruelty. It was the gap between how safe these creatures seemed and how much wild instinct was still sitting quietly underneath the surface, waiting for the one moment, a lowered window, a crossed barrier, an unlocked cage, a night spent alone, when it had the chance to come out. That's really the thread running through every one of these cases. It's rarely about a bad animal. It's about the exact instant a person believed, even for a second, that the rules didn't apply to them, or that a bond built over years made them the exception. A chimpanzee that had never shown aggression in a decade of public appearances. A lion that had been walked on a leash since it was a cub. A dog that had never bitten anyone. A python that had been handled hundreds of times before. None of them had a history that predicted what came next, and that's exactly what makes these stories so unsettling. There was no warning sign to read, no pattern anyone could have caught in advance. Nature doesn't recognize exceptions. It only recognizes opportunity. It's also worth noticing how often the difference between a close call and a tragedy came down to something small, a window that should have stayed up, a barrier that should have stayed intact, a room that shouldn't have been entered alone. Wildlife experts, zookeepers, and animal behaviorists don't build those rules to spoil the experience of getting close to something wild and beautiful. They build them because they've seen again and again exactly how fast the balance can tip. Respect for an animal isn't just admiration from a distance. It's understanding that no matter how gentle, how familiar, or how loved an animal seems, there is always a version of it that neither training nor affection can fully reach. Which one of these stories affected you the most? Let us know in the comments below. And if you want more true accounts of the moment nature turned deadly, make sure you're subscribed for what's coming next.